The world had once been vibrant, filled with bustling cities, a future full of promise, and dreams that stretched far beyond the horizon. But now, in the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse, the world was a desolate wasteland. Cities had crumbled, nature had begun to reclaim what was once its own, and the silence was deafening. It had been 5 years since the outbreak had spread across the globe, yet humanity's survival had become a distant memory for most. Lena Walker, the last known survivor in her once thriving city, walked through the remains of what had been a thriving metropolis. Her once clean clothes were now torn, and her face was a patchwork of dirt and exhaustion. She hadn't been alone in the beginning, but now she was, and the weight of that loneliness was crushing. Her friends, her family, everyone she had once known, was either lost to the horrors of the undead or gone in the chaos that followed. Lena had learned the hard way that survival wasn't just about avoiding zombies, but about managing despair. In the early days, the undead were everywhere. Cities fell within days as chaos spread faster than anyone could react. Governments collapsed, and emergency responses fell apart under the weight of the crisis. At first, there had been hope, a belief that the situation could be contained. But the zombies came faster than anyone anticipated, overwhelming cities with their relentless hunger. Desperate measures were taken, quarantines, evacuations, but it was all futile. The world was quickly losing the war against the undead. Lena remembered her last days with the group she had called family. They had been a tight-knit bunch: Alex, the resourceful mechanic; Sarah, a fiercely loyal nurse; and Marcus, the strong but gentle father figure. Together, they fought their way through the wreckage of the world. But as time passed, it became clear that survival wasn't just about fighting zombies. It was about navigating a world where people were becoming just as dangerous. The collapse of human society had led to the rise of a different kind of threat: desperation. As food and resources dwindled, trust among the living began to erode, and betrayal became a regular part of life. The final straw had come when the group had stumbled upon a safe haven, a small town that was still relatively untouched by the undead. It seemed like an oasis in a desert of despair. But when Marcus had gone missing one night, suspicion had run rampant. Was it the zombies that took him, or had someone in the group made a choice for survival that ended in betrayal? The group fractured in the chaos that followed, and Lena had been left with nothing but her determination to survive. She had no choice but to leave the town behind, wandering into the unknown in search of safety, or at the very least, a reason to keep going. Now, 5 years later, Lena found herself walking alone through the remnants of what had once been a thriving community. She passed by destroyed buildings, some of which still had faded advertisements for products that no longer existed. The world had changed forever, and the things that had once been so important, the latest gadgets, the pursuit of fame, had become irrelevant. There was only survival now. And it wasn't just about avoiding the undead anymore, it was about finding something to live for in a world that had forgotten how to live. Lena's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustle in the distance. Her hand instinctively went to the knife at her side as she crouched behind a pile of debris, her breath steady and controlled. The zombies had adapted over the years. They were no longer the slow, mindless creatures they had once been. The survivors had learned to move quickly and quietly, and those who survived the longest had been the ones who could adapt the fastest. But that didn't mean the undead weren't dangerous. Lena knew better than anyone that the world was still filled with threats. Peering around the corner of the debris, she saw a lone figure limping down the street. It was a man, his clothes ragged and stained. His eyes scanned the area warily, and Lena recognized the haunted look in his eyes, one that mirrored her own. He was a survivor, but for how much longer? In a world like this, survival was no guarantee. The man's eyes shifted, locking onto her hiding spot. Lena froze, waiting to see what he would do. Would he be a threat? Or could he be the answer to her question, the question that had been plaguing her since the world had fallen? What was the point of surviving if there was nothing left to fight for? Lena didn't move as the man continued to stare. It felt like an eternity, and then, slowly, he began to approach her position. The tension in the air was palpable. Could she trust him? Or would he be like the others, someone who would take advantage of the last of her resources, someone who would betray her? As the man drew closer, Lena tightened her grip on her knife. She had survived this long by trusting no one, but there was something about this man, something in his weary eyes, that made her hesitate. The world had changed, but perhaps there was still some small piece of humanity left in it. The man finally stepped into view, just a few feet away from Lena's hiding spot. His eyes were a mixture of wariness and curiosity, but there was no immediate sign of hostility. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but that could mean anything. Lena's grip on her knife tightened. In this world, appearances didn't mean much. People had learned to lie, to wear masks to hide their true intentions. But for some reason, something in his expression made her hesitate. "Who are you?" Lena asked, her voice low and steady. She kept her knife close, just in case. The man paused, studying her with an unreadable gaze. His face was covered in a thick layer of dirt and stubble, but his eyes held a certain sadness, a reflection of the toll this world had taken on him. "I'm just trying to survive," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. His words were simple, but there was an underlying pain in them, something that resonated with Lena. She had heard those words countless times before, but rarely had they been so sincere. Lena didn't lower the knife. She had learned the hard way to be cautious. "Survive how? On your own?" The man's eyes flickered briefly to the street around them, as though checking for danger. Then, he nodded. "It's just me now. Everyone else is gone." Lena's heart tightened in her chest. She knew the feeling all too well, the empty ache of losing everything. She had walked that path for years, never quite knowing if there was anything left worth fighting for. But for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to turn away from him. In this desolate world, there were so few people left. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance, however small, that this man wasn't like the others who had left her broken and alone. "I'm Lena," she finally said, lowering her knife slightly but not fully. "What's your name?" "James," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "James Harper." A long silence stretched between them. Neither of them knew what to say. Words felt useless in this new world where actions spoke louder than anything else. The zombies, they were the obvious threat, but people had become the real danger. Trust was a fragile thing now, and it was something Lena had almost given up on. "Why didn't you just move on?" Lena asked, after a long pause. "There's nothing here. Nothing left." James looked down at the wreckage around them, his expression distant. "I know. But I've been searching. For something, I guess. Some sign that it's not all gone. That there's still a reason to keep going." Lena couldn't help but look at him more closely. She had heard those words before, from people she'd once known. They all searched for meaning in a world that had taken it all away. She had stopped searching long ago, she had simply accepted that survival was all that mattered. "I thought I was the last one left," James continued, his voice a little shakier now. "But I guess I was wrong." For the first time in years, Lena allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there could be something left to fight for. Maybe this man was a sign that there was still hope in a world that had forgotten what hope looked like. "Where are you headed?" she asked cautiously. James shrugged, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I don't know. Just away from here, I guess. I heard rumors of a place. A safe zone. Some kind of refuge. But I haven't found it yet." Lena's heart sank. She had heard those same rumors too, over and over again. Every survivor clung to the hope that there was somewhere they could go, somewhere they could rebuild their lives. But Lena knew better than anyone that such places were often just myths. No one had ever found them, and it had become clear that the world they once knew was gone forever. "Safe zones don't exist," she said flatly. "Not anymore." James met her gaze with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "You don't know that for sure. People still talk about it. Maybe there's something left." Lena stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was still something worth fighting for. But after everything she had seen, the broken cities, the abandoned shelters, the empty promises, she couldn't bring herself to hold on to that hope. "What if you're wrong?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "What if the world is just gone? And all that's left is this, just surviving until you can't anymore?" For a moment, James didn't answer. He simply looked at her, as if weighing her words against his own beliefs. Finally, he spoke. "I don't think I can live like that," he said quietly. "I don't think I can just give up. Not when there's a chance, no matter how small, that something's still out there." Lena felt a pang of longing deep within her. She didn't know if she believed in a safe zone, but she had to admit that the idea of it, a place where survival meant something more than just existing, had its allure. She'd never had the luxury of thinking beyond her next meal or the next place to hide. Maybe it was time to try. Maybe, just maybe, there was a reason to trust someone again. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Maybe I'll go with you," she said, her voice steady but unsure. "We'll see if that safe zone is real. Together." James smiled faintly, the first sign of genuine warmth she'd seen in him. "Together," he agreed. And just like that, for the first time in years, Lena felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and filled with dangers, both undead and human, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could rise from the ashes of this broken world and rebuild something worth living for. To be continued. Lena and James moved quietly through the ruins, the sounds of the decimated city their only company. The once bustling streets, now barren and haunted by the echoes of the past, seemed to close in on them with each step. The air was thick with the scent of decay, both human and mechanical, and the sky above was a washed-out gray, as if the world itself had lost its color along with its soul. The city, with its shattered buildings and rusting cars, was a testament to the end of the world. In the early days of the outbreak, these streets would have been filled with life, with the hum of activity, the rush of traffic, and the simple, comforting noise of people going about their business. But now, those noises had been replaced by the groans of the undead, the clanging of metal, and the howling winds that swept through the empty streets like the breath of a dying planet. "We should stick to the alleys," Lena said, her voice low as they walked. "It's safer that way. The main roads are too exposed." James nodded, his face tight with determination. "I'm with you." For the next few hours, they navigated through the ruins, using the shadows as cover, always alert, always listening for any signs of movement. Zombies were still a threat, though fewer in number than they had once been. The survivors who remained were far more dangerous, scavenging what they could, and often resorting to violence in order to secure whatever resources were left. The landscape around them was as much a battleground as it was a tomb. Everywhere they looked, they saw remnants of lives once lived, broken storefronts, overturned cars, abandoned homes, and the occasional personal belonging discarded in haste. It was a reminder of the world that had been and the life they would never return to. The journey was slow, but Lena didn't mind. Every step they took further from the city felt like a step closer to some semblance of freedom. But despite the growing distance between them and the familiar, now blood-stained streets, a nagging feeling tugged at her gut. She had learned long ago that peace in this world was fleeting, and the further they went, the more vulnerable they would become. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they found shelter for the night in the remains of a small convenience store. The door was broken, but the building's sturdy frame offered a sense of protection against the unknown. Lena secured the door as best as she could, using an old piece of plywood she found nearby. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would have to do. Inside, the store was dark and dusty, the shelves mostly empty. The remnants of snacks and canned goods lay abandoned, many of them years past their expiration dates. But the most important thing was that it was quiet. Lena sat down on the floor, leaning against a dusty shelf. James sat across from her, his face tired but still alert. "You think we'll find it?" Lena asked, breaking the silence. The question had been lingering in her mind for hours, and now it was finally out in the open. She had agreed to this journey, but she wasn't sure what they were really looking for. A safe zone? A myth? A place that could be just as dead as the cities they'd left behind? James glanced at her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite read. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "But I can't stop looking for it. I have to believe there's something more than this. Something worth fighting for." Lena stared at the dimly lit floor, her fingers tracing the rough concrete beneath her. She had been surviving for so long that the thought of fighting for something, anything, other than survival felt foreign. She had abandoned hope long ago. The world had betrayed her, and every time she tried to believe in something, it had been ripped away from her. But James still had hope. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself questioning her own cynicism. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. "Maybe there's something to fight for." James leaned back against the wall, letting out a sigh. "I'm not asking for a paradise. Just a chance to live without fear, without running from the undead or from people who would take everything we have. Even if it's small, even if it's just a glimpse of something better, I want to find it." Lena nodded slowly, her mind spinning with thoughts she didn't know how to put into words. She wasn't sure if she believed in a safe zone, but she couldn't deny that the idea of it, of finding a place to truly live again, was tempting. Maybe it was worth the risk. Maybe not all of humanity had been lost. The silence between them stretched on as the sky outside darkened, but Lena couldn't help but glance at James. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the same pain she had carried for so long. Perhaps, in some strange way, they were both searching for something more. And perhaps, together, they could find it. But as night fell, the familiar fear returned. The silence outside the store was too deep, too still. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She stood up abruptly, her senses alert. "Stay quiet," she whispered to James, her voice tight with caution. She pressed her back against the wall, slowly inching toward the window, her eyes scanning the darkened street outside. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of every second as it stretched on, waiting for the first sign of movement. And then, there it was. A figure in the distance, moving slowly but steadily toward them. Lena's stomach dropped. They were not alone. "Get ready," she murmured, gripping her knife tightly. James looked at her, confusion crossing his face. But then he saw the figure too, and his expression hardened. "We don't know if it's one of them," he said quietly. Lena didn't answer. The figure was getting closer. Slowly, too slowly. But there was no time to waste. The fight for survival had just begun again. The figure moved closer, its shape growing more distinct against the backdrop of the fading twilight. Lena's grip tightened around her knife. Every instinct screamed that they needed to be ready for whatever came next. Her heart hammered in her chest as she silently moved towards the rear of the store, motioning for James to follow. He did so without a word, his eyes never leaving the figure outside. Lena crouched down behind a shelf, pressing herself against the cold concrete of the store's back wall. She could hear James doing the same behind her. The only sounds now were the distant rustling of the wind and the soft shuffle of footsteps outside. The figure had stopped, just a few yards away from the store's entrance. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tell if it was a zombie or a survivor, but the way it moved didn't seem like the slow, stumbling gait of the undead. It was deliberate. Cautious. But then again, it could also be the desperation of someone who had been alone for far too long. A survivor, or a threat, there was no way to tell. Lena glanced over at James, who was crouched low, his face tense. He reached for the makeshift weapon he had found earlier, an old crowbar, and tightened his grip on it. "Do you think it's a zombie?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena shook her head slowly. "Not sure. Stay quiet. If it's a survivor, we can try to talk to them. But if it's a zombie, we fight," James finished for her, his eyes hardening. "Got it." Another long moment passed, the only sound the faint creak of the store's old wooden beams as the wind howled outside. Lena felt the weight of the decision before her. The choice wasn't just about survival, it was about trust, and trust was something that could get you killed in this new world. After all, trust had gotten her to this point of loneliness. It had been broken too many times to count. The figure began moving again, this time closer to the front door, and Lena's heart raced in time with the approaching footsteps. She couldn't just wait here forever. If this person meant them harm, there was no point in letting them get any closer. With a sharp intake of breath, Lena motioned for James to be ready, her fingers gripping her knife. But just as she was about to make her move, a voice rang out, low, but clear. "Anyone in there?" the voice called. Lena froze, her hand instinctively going to her mouth to silence any sound. The voice was strained, tired, but undeniably human. She exchanged a glance with James, whose expression had softened slightly. Whoever it was, they weren't one of the undead. "Please," the voice continued, a hint of desperation creeping in. "I'm not one of them. I'm just looking for a place to rest. Please. I need help." Lena's thoughts raced. She had been alone for so long, and the idea of someone else, someone who might not be hostile, was almost too much to bear. But it also made her cautious. In this new world, everyone had an agenda. Everyone had something they were willing to do to survive. What if this person was just another trap? "We can't trust anyone," she muttered under her breath, though a part of her longed to reach out. James seemed to hear the doubt in her voice. "We'll take it slow," he whispered. "Let's see if they're telling the truth. If they try anything." "I know," Lena interrupted, her eyes narrowing as she listened carefully to the voice outside. There was a brief pause, and then the voice spoke again, more faintly this time. "Please. I'm just trying to survive." The vulnerability in that last plea made something stir in Lena's chest. She couldn't explain it, but it was as though she felt the weight of the person's desperation. After everything she'd been through, after all the walls she had built up to protect herself from pain, it was hard to ignore that feeling. She motioned to James, signaling for him to stay low and quiet. Then, slowly, she crept to the front of the store, keeping as much distance between herself and the door as possible. Peering through a gap in the window's grime, she saw the figure, a man, hunched slightly, wearing a tattered jacket and worn-out boots. His face was gaunt, his skin pale from lack of sun, and his eyes were filled with an exhaustion that seemed almost permanent. He wasn't armed, but his posture suggested he was wary of every noise, every shadow. He was a survivor, just like them. Lena made a quick decision. She had to find out more. She couldn't let fear rule her every choice, or she'd end up alone forever. She grabbed a half-empty bottle of water from the shelf and handed it to James. "Stay here," she whispered. "I'll talk to him." James hesitated but nodded. "Be careful." Lena took a deep breath and slowly, cautiously, unlatched the broken door, just enough for her to slip through. She kept her knife tucked in the waistband of her jeans, hidden but ready. The moment she stepped outside, she was exposed, vulnerable, but there was no turning back now. The man's head snapped around when he heard her, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with tension. He looked surprised, then immediately relieved, but his eyes still darted around nervously, as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. I'm not dangerous," he stammered, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "I just need a place to rest. Please." Lena didn't lower her guard, but she did take a small step forward. "What's your name?" she asked. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Evan. I'm just trying to survive, like everyone else." Lena studied him for a long moment, her mind working through the possibilities. In this world, there were no guarantees. Everyone had their own agenda, their own reasons for doing what they did. But there was something in Evan's eyes, something familiar, that made her hesitate. She had been where he was, at the end of her rope, hoping that someone would show her kindness, hoping that someone would believe her. Evan shifted nervously. "I don't want trouble. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just need help." Lena's grip on her knife loosened, just a fraction. But it was enough. "We can help you," she said finally, her voice steady. "But we do this on our terms. Got it?" Evan nodded quickly, relief flooding his face. "Good," Lena replied. "Then come with me. You can rest for the night. But tomorrow, we leave. You need to keep up." Evan's shoulders seemed to relax, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Lena allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold as it seemed. Maybe there was still a chance for kindness, just enough to get them all through the next day. The night was still, save for the occasional creak of the store's old wood and the soft whisper of wind pushing against the broken windows. Lena, James, and Evan settled in the small corner of the convenience store, with only a few supplies between them. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a strange sense of comfort in the rare moment of silence. Lena sat against a shelf, her eyes flicking between Evan and James. Evan had insisted he was just another survivor, trying to get by in a world gone mad, but Lena wasn't so sure. People didn't come out of the wasteland without something to hide, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Evan sat a few feet away, his back against the wall, his eyes downcast. His clothes were ragged, and his face was hollow from hunger. He hadn't said much after Lena had let him inside, but his nervousness was palpable. Every now and then, his eyes darted around the room, as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "I'm not going to bite you," Lena said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was blunt, but not unkind. She had learned that the best way to deal with uncertainty was to face it head-on. Evan glanced up, a hint of embarrassment in his eyes. "Sorry, it's just hard to trust people, you know? I've seen too much. Been betrayed too many times." Lena nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know the feeling." James, who had been silently watching the exchange, finally spoke. "So what's your story, Evan? Where did you come from?" Evan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flitting from one person to the other. He seemed reluctant to share too much, but the fatigue in his voice couldn't be hidden. "I came from the East. A small group of survivors, mostly families. We were trying to find somewhere safe, a place that hadn't been overrun. But we were ambushed. I was the only one who made it out. Everyone else," he trailed off, unable to finish. Lena exchanged a glance with James. It was a story they had heard before, survivors of a group torn apart by the chaos of the world. It was a common fate, but still, it stung to hear it again. Evan's voice broke through her thoughts. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I don't know who else to talk to." Lena looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You're not the only one with a past full of scars. But you're here now, and that's all that matters. We survive by keeping our heads down and looking out for each other. That's the deal." James, who had been inspecting the few supplies they had found, glanced over. "We can't be too trusting," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "We need to make sure we're all on the same page here. We can help you for now, but when we leave, you need to pull your weight." Evan nodded, his face sincere but still guarded. "I get it. I'll do whatever it takes to survive. I don't want to be a burden." Lena eyed him for a moment longer, then nodded. "We'll leave at first light. It's not safe to stay in one place too long. We'll need to head west, find shelter before nightfall. You're with us until then." Evan seemed to relax slightly at the decision, but Lena could still see the wariness in his eyes. She knew the rules of this world too well, no one did anything without a reason. She couldn't be sure that Evan's intentions were pure, but for now, he was their best chance at making it through another day. As the night dragged on, they ate a small, cold meal of canned beans and dried jerky. The store's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the room. Every now and then, the wind outside picked up, rattling the broken windows and reminding them all that the world beyond was a cruel and unforgiving place. Lena took a deep breath, her eyes tracing the cracks in the walls, the remnants of a civilization that had been lost. It was strange, almost surreal, to think that they could still find anything resembling normalcy in this broken world. But perhaps that was what kept them all going, the hope, however fragile, that things could get better. As she lay down on the cold floor, trying to get some sleep, her thoughts wandered. She wondered about Evan's past. He seemed like a good guy, but then again, so had others before him. It was impossible to trust anyone fully in this world, and yet, the idea of living completely alone again was unbearable. James settled on the floor next to her, his eyes scanning the room one last time before he closed them. "You think he's for real?" he whispered. Lena hesitated before answering. "I don't know. But we need all the help we can get." James grunted in agreement. "You're right about that." The quiet stretched on, but sleep eluded Lena. Her mind churned with thoughts of the future, of the dangerous road ahead. They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would have to face the bigger dangers, the marauders, the more organized groups, or perhaps something even worse. But as the night deepened, one thing became clear. They were in this together now. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena allowed herself a fleeting thought of hope, a hope that, just maybe, they could rebuild something, even in this shattered world. The morning light filtered weakly through the broken windows, casting a muted glow across the desolate store. Lena woke to the familiar ache in her bones, the result of sleeping on the hard floor. She pushed herself up, wincing slightly as she rose to her feet. It had been days, weeks, maybe, since she'd slept properly, but there was no time to dwell on discomfort. The world outside was a ticking clock, and every second spent resting was a second closer to danger. Evan was already awake, rummaging through the supplies they'd scavenged last night. He was quieter now, his earlier nervous energy subdued by the solemnity of their situation. Lena observed him for a moment, studying his movements, his reluctance to make eye contact. He wasn't the only one who had been broken by the world, they all had been. But the truth was, Lena couldn't afford to feel sympathy. Not when survival was the only currency left. "Ready to go?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Evan paused, his hand hovering over a can of beans, before he looked up at her. "Yeah. Just making sure I have everything." Lena nodded, her eyes flicking to James, who was already securing his pack, the crowbar slung across his back. She couldn't remember the last time they had felt any sense of normalcy, but the routine of preparing for the unknown had become second nature. There was always something to pack, something to check, some new threat to anticipate. "Let's move out in 10, Lena ordered, already heading for the door. The road ahead was uncertain, and every step they took was a step deeper into the unknown. After spending so many months avoiding the larger groups of survivors, Lena had decided they needed to head west, to see if there was any chance of finding a place that wasn't completely overrun. It was a gamble, but right now, it was the only option they had. The outside air was thick with the smell of decay, rotting wood, burning tires, and the distant scent of the forest. It was the scent of a world that had died, and yet life still stubbornly clung on. The streets were eerily quiet as they stepped out from the relative safety of the store, their footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. Nothing moved except the occasional wind-blown scrap of paper or tattered plastic bag. Evan walked slightly behind them, eyes darting nervously. He hadn't said much since they left the store, but Lena could feel the tension radiating from him. He was still an unknown quantity, someone whose past was as murky as the future they all faced. "Stay sharp," Lena muttered, her hand resting on the knife tucked in her waistband. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, constantly shifting between the shadows. It was an instinct born of necessity, never letting down your guard, never allowing yourself to be caught off guard. It was a lesson learned the hard way, and one she would never forget. James walked ahead, his eyes locked on the road, but his body language was different now, more cautious. She could tell he was waiting for something. He had seen enough to know that nothing in this world was predictable. Not the weather. Not the people. Not even the very ground beneath their feet. As they moved down the abandoned streets, they passed a few wrecked vehicles, their windows shattered and doors ajar. Every corner felt like a potential danger. It was a reminder of how quickly civilization had collapsed. There had been a time when the world had functioned, when people had places to be and lives to live. But now? Now, all that remained were ruins, and any trace of normal life felt like a distant memory. What if we don't find anything? Evan asked quietly, his voice tentative. Lena didn't look back but answered with a cold edge in her voice. Then we'll keep moving. We always keep moving. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their boots tapping against the concrete the only noise. Lena's thoughts drifted, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what might be out there, other survivors, perhaps, or maybe some kind of sanctuary. The possibility of finding something real again, a place where they could rebuild and not just survive, seemed almost like a fantasy. But she clung to it anyway. Without hope, what was the point of any of this? After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of town, and the landscape before them began to change. The concrete gave way to dirt roads, and the buildings grew sparse, replaced by the overgrown remnants of farms and homes. The road ahead was rough, but it was the only path they had, and there was no turning back now. Lena could see the horizon in the distance, the thick, green canopy of the forest stretching as far as the eye could see. They would need to find shelter before nightfall. Forests weren't safe after dark, especially with the number of creatures and people who had taken to the wilderness. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice steady. "We'll make camp in the woods tonight." James nodded without a word, and Evan gave a short, strained nod, his eyes darting around. The woods weren't far, but as they made their way closer, Lena noticed something unusual, an odd sound in the distance, like the rumble of engines. It was faint but unmistakable. She stopped dead in her tracks, holding up a hand to signal the others to stop. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice sharp. James stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Sounds like trucks." Lena nodded, her stomach tightening. This wasn't good. In this world, the sound of engines usually meant one thing: people, and not the friendly kind. The last time she had encountered a group with vehicles, it hadn't ended well. They all stood still for a moment, listening. The sound was getting closer. "Take cover," Lena ordered. "Now." They moved quickly, ducking into the tall grass that lined the side of the road, just out of sight. Lena's heart raced as she crouched low, scanning the road. Whoever was coming wasn't stopping, they were getting closer, and fast. Evan crouched next to her, his breathing shallow. "What do we do?" he asked, fear evident in his voice. Lena's mind raced. There was no time for second-guessing. "We wait. Let them pass." The sound of the engines grew louder, and the hairs on the back of Lena's neck stood on end. Whoever was driving those trucks was too close for comfort. She could feel her pulse quicken, her body coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. This could be it, the moment they would have to fight or run. And in this world, both options could be just as deadly. The sound of the trucks grew louder and closer, reverberating through the air. Lena could hear the heavy thrum of the engines, a stark reminder of the violence and chaos that had consumed the world. She stayed crouched low in the grass, her hand gripping the hilt of her knife, her body poised for whatever might come next. Beside her, James was equally still, his eyes scanning the road, muscles tense, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Evan, though, looked uneasy, his face pale and his hands trembling as he gripped the strap of his backpack. Lena knew he had little experience with confrontation of this scale, but he was learning fast. They waited in silence, the only sound the distant rumble of the approaching trucks. The sun, now high in the sky, cast long shadows as the vehicles rounded a bend just out of sight. There were at least 3 of them, the engines growling like beasts hunting in the wild. Lena's pulse raced. They couldn't afford to be spotted. Through the tall grass, Lena peered out cautiously. The first truck came into view, a rusted, heavily armored vehicle, its tires churning up dust as it barreled down the road. Behind it were 2 more, both similarly armed, with makeshift steel plating and barbed wire draped over their fronts. These weren't ordinary survivors, these were people who had come to take, to dominate, to control whatever scraps of civilization they could find. Lena held her breath as the convoy passed by, the trucks so close she could hear the clanking of metal and the occasional shouted command. She could make out a few figures sitting in the open back of the trucks, their faces hidden by the shadows beneath their hoods. The leader of the group, a burly man with a thick beard and a scar running down his cheek, was in the front truck, scanning the horizon like a hawk looking for prey. His eyes flicked briefly to the side, and for a moment, Lena felt sure he could see her. Her heart stopped, but then, the convoy moved on without slowing. She exhaled slowly, her body relaxing just enough to let the tension go. But the danger wasn't over yet. These people weren't the kind to leave survivors behind, especially not ones who might pose a threat to their power. James leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to move, now. They'll circle back if they don't find anything." Lena nodded. They couldn't take any chances. They'd been lucky so far, but they wouldn't be if they stayed put for much longer. "Follow me, and keep low," she instructed. The group moved as quickly as they dared, slipping silently through the tall grass, using the broken landscape as cover. They crept along the side of the road, staying out of sight as the convoy continued down the path. The last truck was nearly out of range when a faint shout rang out from behind them. "Hey! What's that over there?" Lena's heart skipped a beat. They had been spotted. The shout was followed by a series of rapid orders, and the truck screeched to a halt. Metal doors slammed open, and armed figures poured out of the vehicles, their footsteps heavy and purposeful. Lena cursed under her breath. There was no way they were going to outrun these people. "Move," she barked, pulling Evan and James behind a nearby pile of rubble, her eyes scanning the road for an escape route. The sound of boots crunching over gravel grew louder. They had no time to hesitate. "They're coming for us," James said, his voice tight with panic. "We need to get to the trees, now." Lena nodded grimly. The forest wasn't far, and it offered some cover, but the thought of running toward it made her stomach twist. They were too close to the road, and if they didn't act fast, the men would catch up to them before they could disappear into the trees. She turned to Evan, her voice hard. "Can you run?" Evan looked terrified, but he nodded. "Yeah. I can." "Good," she said, her voice still cold. "When I say go, we run. No looking back. Just keep moving, and don't stop." The sound of the men's voices was getting closer now, the clatter of metal boots and the metallic clang of weapons. She could almost feel their eyes on her, their presence closing in around them. The time for waiting was over. "Go!" Lena shouted. In an instant, they were on their feet, sprinting through the broken remnants of the street and into the trees. The underbrush caught at their feet, but they pushed forward, the sound of their feet pounding against the earth mingling with the distant sounds of the men behind them. Lena could hear the shouts now, the pursuit growing closer. She didn't dare glance behind her, but she could feel the danger creeping ever nearer. The forest wasn't far, but the road was still in sight. "Faster!" James urged, pulling ahead. They were almost there when a shot rang out, the deafening crack of gunfire echoing through the trees. The bullet whizzed past Lena's ear, narrowly missing her. She jerked to the side, her heart racing. "They're shooting at us!" Evan screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "We can't stop!" Lena shouted back, her eyes locked on the narrow gap between the trees that would lead them to relative safety. The gunfire continued behind them, but they didn't have the luxury of slowing down. They had to outrun it. The forest's edge was just ahead, the thick canopy offering the promise of concealment. But just as Lena thought they were in the clear, she heard the roar of an engine, the truck engines coming after them, gaining ground. Without thinking, Lena took a sharp left, forcing the others to follow. The path ahead narrowed, and the thick underbrush made it hard to move fast, but the trucks couldn't follow the tight, winding trail. It was their only hope. They pushed through, hearts hammering, adrenaline surging. The truck's engines sputtered as they veered off the main road, unable to follow the survivors through the dense foliage. But the men would not give up easily. Lena's mind raced, trying to think of their next move. The woods could offer some protection, but there were no guarantees. They needed to keep moving, and they needed a place to hide, fast. To be continued. Lena's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she and the others pushed through the dense underbrush. The sound of the trucks revving and engines sputtering grew fainter, but it wasn't gone. The men weren't going to stop just because they couldn't follow them on the narrow trail. They would circle the woods, they would search everything in their power to hunt them down. She glanced over her shoulder briefly, her heart still pounding in her chest. Evan was struggling to keep up, his legs giving way under the weight of his backpack, his face flushed with fear. James was ahead, glancing back occasionally, his face a mask of determination. "Keep going!" Lena shouted over the crunch of their steps. "We need to find cover, a defensible position." Evan stumbled, his leg twisting awkwardly as he tripped over a root. He caught himself just in time but let out a frustrated cry. Lena stopped and rushed back to him, her heart sinking when she saw the look of panic on his face. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice firm but calm, "but I won't leave you behind." He nodded, sucking in a breath as he regained his footing. "I'm okay. Just, give me a second." Lena didn't waste time. "We can't afford that." James had already disappeared deeper into the woods, but he yelled back to her, "I think I found something. This way." She turned sharply, grabbing Evan's arm and pulling him toward the sound of James' voice. Her mind raced. Every second they wasted was another second those men could use to track them. If they didn't find a secure spot to hide soon, they'd be cornered with no way out. They reached James, who had crouched beside an old, abandoned cabin half hidden by thick trees and vines. The structure was decaying, but it still looked solid enough to offer some shelter. "This is it," James said, his voice low. "We can fortify it, at least for a little while." Lena nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. They couldn't stay out in the open forever, and this cabin offered the best chance they had. She motioned for Evan to go first, then followed behind him, her eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of the trucks. Inside, the cabin was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rotting wood. But it was better than being exposed in the woods, where they were sitting ducks. Lena quickly moved to the window, peering through the cracks in the rotting boards. There was no sign of the trucks yet, but she knew they were out there, somewhere, waiting, planning. These men weren't stupid. They'd come for them eventually. She turned to face James and Evan. "We need to secure the cabin. Barricade the doors, the windows. We don't know how much time we have." Evan, his face pale but determined, nodded and began to work on the door, using nearby debris to push against it. James started piling heavy logs near the windows, covering the small gaps where light filtered in. As they worked, Lena's mind raced. The cabin was only a temporary solution, a brief respite. But it gave them a chance to plan, a chance to fight back if necessary. The fear that had taken root deep in her stomach didn't loosen. It had only grown stronger, sharper. She had led them into this corner. Now she had to get them out. Minutes passed in tense silence as they fortified their positions. The sun had started to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. Lena's eyes darted to the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Her hand rested on the hilt of her knife, ready for whatever was coming next. And then, faintly at first, she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. "They're close," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of the truth. The men were near, and they would not give up easily. Evan pressed himself against the wall, his breathing shallow. James positioned himself by the window, peering through the gaps with a look of determination. They were ready for whatever was about to happen. Lena couldn't afford to hesitate. They were outnumbered, and the odds were slim, but this wasn't a time to run anymore. She had come this far, and if she was going to die in this world, it would be on her terms. She had to protect her own, protect Evan, protect James. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice firm. "Not now. We fight. If they want us, they'll have to come through us." James gave her a quick, tight nod, his fingers tightening around the makeshift weapon he had grabbed, a broken piece of wood, jagged and dangerous. Evan, though shaking, stood tall, gripping a rusty pipe like it was his lifeline. The sounds outside grew louder, more footsteps, low murmurs, and the faint metallic clang of weapons being drawn. Lena's mind raced as she scanned the room, calculating their next move. They couldn't stay in this cabin. But they couldn't afford to run either. The forest would swallow them whole. "I have an idea," Lena said. "We can set a trap. The trees around here are dense. If we're careful, we can lead them into the woods and get them separated. We have the advantage in the trees. But we need to act fast." James looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet trust. "Lead the way." They gathered whatever they could use, pieces of wood, sharp stones, and old, rusted tools. Lena was ready. She had always been ready, whether she had the strength to believe it or not. The door to the cabin groaned as it cracked open, the first sign of their impending confrontation. Lena gave one final, determined look at the group. "Here they come." End of story.